Hi everyone, I'm Rincey and this is Rincey Reads. Today I'm going to be doing a book review on The Will of the Many. This is a fantasy book that I was hearing a lot of buzz about towards the end of last year. In this story, you are following this character who calls himself Viz, and he used to belong to a different sort of culture or part of like this world that we're in. I'm going to do my best to try to explain what's happening here, but this world is based on sort of like this Roman style hierarchy system where the people who are on like the lower tiers have to like succeed some of their will to the people in the higher tiers in order for society to function properly. But the main character was part of a culture that didn't like partake in all of that stuff, but then when he was young, his hometown or like home country, I suppose you could call it, was attacked and taken over, and his family, who was actually royalty, a lot of them were killed. Viz ends up like changing his identity and running away and doing all these things, and now at the beginning of the book he is staying in an orphanage and he like fights in these like underground sort of boxing situations, or like feels more like MMA type of fights, as a way to like earn money and things like that. And he is hoping to basically increase his status so that way he can have some sort of revenge and or just like kind of get out of the society that he is currently living in. Like he doesn't want to be a part of this at all. And then one day after a fight, he ends up gaining the attention of a really high-ranking man, and that high-ranking person ends up basically adopting him and putting him into this special elite academy. And there are reasons why he wants specifically Viz to be a part of the academy, because he has some ulterior motives for adopting him and putting him in this situation, which he does explain, but you know, you can find that out for yourself as you read this book. So yeah, like I said, this is a fantasy novel, and it's one that I was hearing a decent amount of buzz about. It was a book that like kind of piqued my interest, but I don't read a lot of fantasy books, and especially high fantasy books I kind of am slightly weary about, just because I am someone who has a harder time with high fantasy. However, I saw people comparing this to The Name of the Wind, which is a book that I really enjoyed. I really enjoyed both books in that series. And I also heard people say that this had like that magical school element, which is like one of my favorite things in a fantasy book. And then this book also has a competition sort of aspect to this book, which is like also one of my favorite things. So like literally like my two favorite things in fantasy stories are magical school setups and competitions. It's why I love the Hunger Games, or part of the reason why I love the Hunger Games. It's why Goblet of Fire is my favorite Harry Potter. Like those elements very much are my jam. And so I picked this up, and I have to admit, like the first like third of the book is very much just Viz like outside of the school, like before he gets adopted and things like that. So for me personally, I had a harder time kind of like getting going into this book, but once we entered the school part, it became like really, really fascinating and really intriguing. Personally, I'm not super familiar with this author, but like I talked to one of my friends who reads a lot of fantasy books, and he was like, oh yeah, I've read this author before, he's really good. And so now I'm sort of like intrigued by this author's other books, but I just think that this was just a really fun, well done story. It's playing with a lot of like ideas and tropes that are common in fantasy books. You know, this sort of like hierarchy, class system situation that's set up in this school as well as the society is not necessarily like the most unique thing, but it is interesting to see sort of how he is tackling it. Viz as a character is super intriguing because he's only like 16, 17 years old, something along those lines, but he's just been through so much over the course of his life that he seems significantly like older and wiser. He's a very smart character, but he has like a lot of anger issues, which can be his downfall a lot of times. And it's interesting to see sort of the way that he is navigating this world and society, especially once he enters the school, that he also kind of doesn't want to be a part of it all. Like he's walking this fine line of trying to gain like power and access so that way he can basically escape this world. But in order to gain that power and access, you sometimes have to make compromises on the things that you would typically do. But then there are other times when he refuses to compromise or finds his own way of doing things in order to like continue to just kind of like live outside of the way this world is structured. One of the things that I found really interesting in this book is like the way that the relationships are set up, not just like romantic relationships, but like friendships and everything. Like the way that Viz as a character approaches all of the people around him is really intriguing because he is both, you know, wary of everyone who is in the school and who he's interacting with because they're all a part of this world that he hates and kind of doesn't want to exist. But, you know, there are people there that he does get along with and stuff like that. And so it's really interesting to see sort of how he navigates all of these different relationships and friendships. There's also this just sort of underlying conspiracy theory sort of situation going along here. And so the way that Viz has to kind of walk multiple lines basically because he's being brought into this academy for a specific reason. And so he has like specific things he's trying to do at all times, but also he needs to like do well in school in order to advance. But also like the principal or whatever, the main person who's in charge, the headmaster, whatever. He's also suspicious of Viz because Viz and Viz's like adopted father are butting heads for reasons that you find out. And so there's like this really interesting sort of balance that the character is forced to like live in. It's interesting to see sort of like how he chooses what to do and how to do things and stuff like that. There were multiple parts of this book where I'm like, well, this is very convenient. And there are very like convenient outs to very difficult situations that you're like, okay, well, that was just like very lucky, or, you know, that worked out pretty well. But I think for the most part, you know, the way things unfold really makes sense. This is book one in a series. I don't know how many books are going to be in the series. If there is a number, I do know that there is at least a second one coming out because the ending, you know, is kind of incomplete. I feel like I finished this book with a lot of questions, and I don't know if I necessarily understood everything that happened towards the end of the book, but I think I got a lot of it. And I do think that the author did a really good job of like surprising me with some of the plot developments. Like there were certain things that I expected to happen or that I thought would happen just based on what typically happens in fantasy books. And the author was able to surprise me. This book is on the longer side. And so for me personally, it took me a little bit longer to read it. Some of the fight scenes are kind of intense, at least for me personally. And so those I had a little bit of a harder time with. But overall, I really enjoyed my experience with this book, and I'm definitely looking forward to picking up the next book whenever it comes out. But yeah, I think that this is a fantasy book that is getting a decent amount of attention. And I think that it's, you know, worth the hype. If you're someone who enjoys, you know, dark academia, magical school systems, all of those things, I think that this book will definitely satisfy a lot of those like check boxes. But I will just say again that like the first third for me personally gets off to a little bit of a slower start. And so I would say at least get to like part 2, or at least the part once he gets like adopted and he starts training and things like that, because I think that's when it starts to get really interesting and you see a lot more of the details of the plot start to come together or start to become more clear, as opposed to the first third, which feels like a lot of setup to get to know the world and where the character is starting and things like that. So yeah, those are my quick thoughts on The Will of the Many. Let me know down in the comments below if you read this book, what your thoughts were on it. Or if you have any questions, feel free to leave that down in the comment section as well. Or if you have any other recommendations of magical school stories, I'm always looking for them. So feel free to leave that down in the comment section as well. So yeah, that's all I have for now, and thanks for watching.